Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this New Year's edition of Strange Playgrounds. As you can no doubt hear, feeling a lot better this end. A lot better. No more mucus. Not much, anyway. There may be one or two sniffles and hacks and coughs throughout the course of this, but beyond that, I think we'll be fine. Today, on this New Year's Day, upon which I'm recording, just got home from my friend's house where we spent the New Year's playing video games and discussing everything under the sun. Lots of fun. Lots and lots of fun. Yarnham, the people of Yarnham know how to throw a good New Year's Eve party, I can tell you. Woo, boy, lots of fun. I think you think alcohol is bad. Wait till you've tried healing blood. Believe me. Whew, there's not an intoxicant or a high like it. You just have to get used to the mutations and the madness that follow. But that's fine by me. No issues there. I really want to talk to you about something that's been pervasive on the internet recently, which is the Black Mirror episode Bandersnatch. Longtime fan of Black Mirror. I like Black Mirror because I have a penchant for that particular kind of science fiction. The kind of science fiction that's in the more sort of Philip K. Dick, William Gibson vein. Than, say, the stuff that I would say masquerades as science fiction, or rather that's not necessarily fair. It doesn't masquerade as science fiction. It is unfairly categorized as science fiction. Stuff like Star Wars, for example, or even Star Trek, which is not necessarily what I would consider to be science fiction. They are different types of shows. Star Wars is more of a mythological fantasy. It's more of like a religious fable that's dressed up in the patina of science fiction. It is not, but certainly not in the strictest sense of the term science fiction, because it doesn't deal with the potentials of science, or it doesn't utilize the imagery of the potentials of science to explore present-day themes or concerns. It's much more of a meta-narrative. It's much more mythological. It's basically the Lord of the Rings. It's the hero's journey. It's the impossibility of redemption and blah 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 blah. It's all that stuff. It's the old mythological tropes just dressed up in a slightly more postmodern patina. Whereas stuff like, say, William Gibson's Neuromancer, stuff like Black Mirror, it's much more legitimately science fiction in the sense that it not only deals with the potentialities of scientific and technological discovery, which it certainly does, but it also utilizes that subject matter to explore very pervasive present-day themes and concerns. That is often the misconception people have with science fiction. They believe that because it is often set in a kind of futurescape, that it is necessarily futurist, or that it necessarily projects onto tomorrow. That is not necessarily the case. A very good example, if you look at George Orwell, if you look at 1984. 1984 is technically science fiction because it deals with a sort of day after the day after tomorrow, where a massively totalitarian state has subsumed the UK. But it is not a warning, as a lot of people seem to think it is. It's not telling you, it's not finger wagging and saying, you better be careful, or this might happen. What 1984 is exploring are the ways that this has happened and is happening now, or rather at the time of writing. It is an exploration of particular of the nature of totalitarianism, of how it functions. That's the thing with 1984, and that is also true of many science fiction stories. Like, for example, the work of Philip K. Dick. Although it is often set quite far into the future and deals with technologies that are quite abstruse, the point is not to extrapolate what might be happening. The point is to explore very human concerns regarding identity and sense of self, and how that is influenced and manufactured and contrived, and how that can be used to delude us, because those were concerns of Dick's own, because he had issues with his own personality. He had incredible psychological issues. Probably not helped by his excessive drug use. That's a mistake people make with science fiction very, very often. They assume that it has to be futurist, that it has to be sort of projectionist. Black Mirror is one of those wonderful science fiction series that doesn't do that. most of the episodes actually are set not like massively far into the future, but it's the day after tomorrow or the day after tomorrow that explores situations and scenarios that are very believable, and even technological innovations that are not only very believable but are often derived from things that are actually happening now. Charlie Brooker, the creator of Black Mirror and the lead writer, is very good at getting his finger on the pulse of exploring things that are happening culturally and politically, and in terms of what is being discovered in science, and extrapolating that into stories that explore very pervasive, often unspoken or unarticulated concerns and drives. It's a way of raking science fiction at its very best, is a way of raking the subconscious of the present day, but doing so in such a manner that it's clothed in a sort of projected scenario. That's what science fiction does. It's very similar to what horror does, and indeed what fantasy does at its best. It's why they are so often categorized collectively as speculative fiction. They very often explore very, very similar concerns, and in very similar ways, but utilizing slightly different imagery. If you really pare down a lot of horror, for example, and then compare and contrast the same autopsied skeleton with that of science fiction, you will find a very similar framework under there, because they are both fundamentally storytelling structures, or genres of storytelling that incorporate many different kinds of structure, rather. But they are still fundamentally genres of storytelling, and therefore adhere to very particular forms, as necessitated by the medium. Now, Bandersnatch, the latest episode of Black Mirror, was billed up as something big, and it's interesting. It's really interesting. I sat down to watch it and spent a good 2 hours playing around with it, and this is a key point. Bandersnatch is interactive. It's got a sort of hint of video game about it, a hint of it's sort of Ian Livingstone choose your own adventure books and whatnot. Bandersnatch is not it's not even the first sort of visual media to do this. It is not the first visual media to do this by any stretch of the imagination. There are quite a lot of artifacts from the early days of video gaming that did it. There are even stuff from there are things on YouTube that you can go and have a look at that do it. The thing about Bandersnatch is that it's one of the first bits of work to bring this kind of interactivity in visual media to a mainstream audience, and on a platform like Netflix. And it does it rather well, I've got to say. For me, the episode is, for one thing, it's interesting on a subjective level. The setting and the subject matter is really one that chimes with me. It's basically, it centres around the sort of bedroom coder phenomena of the UK in the 1980s. In the 1980s, there was this enormous explosion in home computing in the UK, thanks to the availability of things like the Sinclair Spectrum, like the old microcomputers, basically. And there were, in the very earliest days of home video gaming, these coders who were just kids. Often they were just kids some of them weren't even out of high school, who taught themselves coding, taught themselves how to produce basic video games, and then took their work into the then burgeoning studios, which were obviously very small back then. Video gaming itself was only very niche back then, and whose work was licensed and purchased and often became overnight successes. These kids who weren't even out of high school or just out of high school often became overnight successes. They were often these, because of the nature of coding and of sort of bedroom coding, which requires a kind of very particularly obsessive sort, they were often very antisocial types, or as some put it, social phobic types. Quite a lot of people who existed to some degree on the autistic spectrum. They were very particular individuals. And if you go and have a look on YouTube, you will find entire documentaries about this era and about particular bedroom coders. I would particularly recommend Kim Justice. I really love Kim Justice's documentaries about this phenomena. she goes really deep. She goes really deep into looking at, particularly in the UK, the sort of computer video game cultures that are often left out of more mainstream documentaries, which tend to focus more on Japan and the USA. There was this enormous explosion throughout the 1980s and 1990s in homegrown UK video gaming companies and individuals who were sort of like auteurs. They were like video gaming rock stars, you know? And that's what this is about. And you have to bear in mind, Charlie Brooker got his start in this very genre. He got his start as a video game journalist way back in the day in this very culture. So and not only that, he has clearly followed the culture of video gaming since then. He knows whereof he speaks. And even were it not for the interactive element of Bandersnatch, the little references to that era and to the video games of the era, the little cultural touchstones and whatnot, it's totally esoteric. Only people who know about them would see them and find them entertaining. Stuff like the poster of Manic Miner on the wall, you know, that kind of thing. That really made me smile. I really liked it. And I also really, really loved the portrayal of the coders themselves. There are two main coders, two main video game designers, and I loved them both. I thought they were really cool characters, very recognizable characters. The main character, who is... He actually plays this kind of detached, socially awkward, very, very autistic young man beautifully. It's a really cool performance. Counterpointed to this other guy who is much more socially apt, who is much more sort of ingrained in the culture. He's sort of almost like a video game rock star at this point, who is almost like a mentor figure. I loved that dichotomy. I thought they were both really interesting. I thought they were complex characters. It also ties into the drug and narcotic culture that was very pervasive at the time. The musical culture, which was part and parcel of that, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that element of it. The aesthetics were very 1980s, very legitimately 1980s, which I also really liked. The show also does that very wonderful science fiction thing of playing with perceptions of reality, playing with perceptions of self. It basically utilizes the notion of choice within video games and the notion of divergent paths to extrapolate into the concept of divergent paths within reality, and therefore divergent realities in and of themselves. It's not a new thing at all. It's really not a new concept by any stretch of the imagination, but it's done rather well here. I've got to say, I think it is done rather well here. There is a meta element to it. The characters gradually become aware that their reality and their choices are delusions, that there are multiple branching paths of reality, and that there are external forces fucking with every decision that they make. And it's about how that interactivity with the audience transforms perceptions of reality on a wider level. So it not only fucks with the characters' perceptions of reality, it fucks with ours as well. Because it necessarily leads us to question, well, if a simulation is necessarily complex enough to simulate a kind of reality, then you can never be sure that you're not existing in one. You can never be certain, especially if the simulation is your marker for reality. If it's the only reality you've ever known, then there's no way of discerning what's simulation and what's not. And that's part and parcel of the themes that are being played with here. I liked the interactivity. I thought it could have gone further. I would have liked, and don't get me wrong, this may come out later on. There may be more stuff in this show that we haven't found yet. I can imagine that later on, this show is going to it's going to become the stuff of legend. I imagine it's going to spawn lots of myths and rumors that if you take this path through it, if you make these choices within this time frame, then you get this special ending, blah blah blah, all of that crap. The stuff that's part and parcel of the mythologies of video gaming. You get this with video games all the time. That if you do this or you do that, then you get this, you unlock this Easter egg or you unlock this secret, which is often bollocks. It's often myth. It's often just rumor mongering and myth making. A little bit like Ermac in the Mortal Kombat games. Ermac, way back in the day when Mortal Kombat was just an arcade game, gamers would sometimes get a black screen that just had Ermac across it, and that spawned the notion of a hidden character in Mortal Kombat that you had to do all sorts of elaborate things to unlock. It was total bollocks. It was total wankery. Ermac was an error message that the cabinets would display when something went wrong inside of them. But it became such a pervasive myth. There are so many bullshit rumors out there about how you unlocked Ermac that he became a character. They actually, the creators of Mortal Kombat coded him into the game. And I can see Bandersnatch being rather like that, because since Charlie Brooker is so aware of this stuff, I can easily foresee updates to it, if there are not hidden secrets in it already. And I know there are a couple of secret endings. I've found a couple of them, but I could have done with a bit more of that. I think it could have used a bit more in the way of choice and a bit more in the way of consequence for that choice. What I found was too many of the paths led to the same outcome, and the ultimate outcomes, none of them are as satisfying as I kind of wanted them to be. I would have liked it to have gone much further. I really like the moments, for example, when I, as the audience, was directly interacting with the characters, when the characters had become aware that there was someone fucking with their choices, and it was kind of driving them mad, and they were asking me things. I really liked that. But it doesn't go anywhere, sadly. It really doesn't go anywhere. What I would have liked the show to have done is then start fucking with my perception of reality. I mean, if it became almost viral, if there was some way of making the episode fuck with your computer or the format that it's playing on, so that you start getting messages, you start getting signs, that would have been wonderful, because that, to me, is the ultimate implication of this kind of work. And it is there. It's definitely there, it's just not as pervasive as it could have been, and it's not as satisfying as it could have been. It's a very interesting experiment in narrative form for visual media. Not a unique one, not a new one, but a very interesting one. And I like the fact that it drew such an audience. It has basically ignited the internet, which I'm very pleased about, because even if you don't think it's entirely successful, which I don't, I think it's a very good episode of Black Mirror. I think it's a very good episode, and I think it's very interesting. I love, as I say, love the subject matter, love the themes, really like the story, and the differing story arcs that go on depending upon how you operate, what decisions you make, the protagonist make. I liked that a lot, but it doesn't go far enough. For example, one of the things I liked a lot when it started to happen is when the protagonist started to resist me. When I started to make decisions for him and he started to stop himself from doing them. I loved that. I really loved that. More of that. I would have loved to have seen that dichotomy taken even further, and what kind of insanity, what kind of like schizophrenic lunacy that would have resulted in if it had continued. Yeah, I really liked that, and also I wished that it involved me a little bit more emotionally as the audience. And I know these are constraints of technology and of the platform and the format. I'm aware of that, and of time, of course. It's very difficult if you want to do this kind of storytelling in a more passive medium that is not strictly a video game, like a Netflix show. It's very difficult, and I understand that there must have been massive constraints on this, and filming all of the various outcomes and whatnot must have been very hard indeed. But I would have liked it to maybe have been a longer term project that had more going on in it, and extrapolated further, went deeper, went much more balls to the wall, ripping apart preconceptions of reality, insanity. That's what I would have liked to have seen. Something a bit more surreal. something a bit more even maybe metaphysical, because it does border on metaphysics. It does definitely border on metaphysics. It's that point at which science fiction and fantasy really blend together and become almost inextricable from one another, certainly indistinguishable from one another. I enjoyed it for what it was. I enjoyed the ambition of it. I enjoyed the setting and the subjects and the imagery. I enjoyed the characters. I thought the characters were all really interesting. Very damaged, very lost, very uncomfortable in their own skins characters. Loved that. Loved it, loved it, loved it. But it could have gone further for me, and it could have gone deeper. I would have liked for... And it's the same... I feel the same way about most stories that have this theme. A very good example is the original Matrix. The original Matrix was everyone raved about as though it was something new and something novel. No, it wasn't. It wasn't. The degree to which the original Matrix throws into doubt preconceptions of absolute reality are very finite. I find very finite, and I think it should have gone much further. It should have gone much further in undermining what both the characters and promote as the fundamental reality, and that very concept, but also the audience. There should have been a greater degree of this kind of interactivity in the original Matrix, for my money, where it throws your preconceptions of reality into question. That's what all the best fiction of this kind does, for my money. It makes you question preconceptions of self, like to what degree can you ever be certain that your assumptions of your own personality are correct? How can you ever possibly discern and assess the influences and input that shape your preconceptions of personality and your perceptions of the world? It's a very complex, very thorny problem that I explore in my own fiction a lot, but in very different ways, I explore it through sort of more metaphysical, revelatory ways than Brooker does here. But it's a very, very worthwhile watch, I would say. I mean, I spent a couple of hours playing with it because it is entertaining. It's very entertaining. And it is intriguing. You care enough about the characters and about the situation that you want to know. You want to know the truth. You want to know, like, are you, within the mythology of this show, of this episode, are you a product of delusion? Are you a voice inside a schizophrenic young man's head? Or are you actually an objectively existing external manipulator who is watching him through the medium of Netflix and manipulating his actions? Who knows? Who knows? There is not a fundamental answer here. There is not a fundamental answer. A lot of the paths, I find, they can lead to some very entertaining endings, and I won't spoil them, but some of them are very entertaining and very sort of irreverent. As serious as it sometimes gets, as dark as the subject matter can be, because it does deal with perceptions of reality, with one's state of mind, how one determines and discerns one's own state of mind and one's decision-making processes, and how one assumes certain things about decision-making, and how that is often misconceived or a simplification, a reduction. It throws into question the entire notion of decision-making as a conscious notion. The notion of conscious decision-making itself comes under scrutiny here, and indeed the notion of free will, which is a complete and utter delusion anyway. We don't have time within the framework of this particular podcast to go into that, but free will is such a bollocks notion. It is so ridiculously synthetic. But I like the fact that Bandersnatch has brought these themes and subjects to the mainstream, that there are people out there discussing this now as a result of this episode. That makes me very happy. That makes me very happy indeed. That said, I don't think it's as successful as it could have been. It could have gone a lot further, a lot deeper, a lot stranger, and a lot more transgressive with its imagery, for me. It's an interesting start. Let's say that. It's an interesting start. I can foresee from this moment lots of shows aping it. I can see lots of shows taking the fundamental format and doing more with it. I can see new forms of television and cinema resulting from it. Potentially. Potentially. But let's see, shall we? Let's see where it goes. So yes, I enjoyed Bandersnatch for what it was. It's not as progressive or as expansive, as strange or as transgressive as it could have been, but that's okay. It's a good first step for my money. It's a decent enough first step down this road, and at least it has had the effect of bringing these deviant forms of storytelling into the mainstream. So let's see where we go, shall we? So yes, until next time, ladies and gentlemen, bye bye.